Tena koto katoa. Ngā mihi nui for everyone coming along to join this wonderful korero. And those of you joining by online as well. So this is a very informal, formal seminar organized by...
Very informal.
Very informal?
Yeah, very informal.
Okay, yeah. I had a speech though, but that's okay.
I mean, we'll have 3 minutes formal and then we go into more.
Perfect.
Yeah, dialogic.
So, yeah, organized by Rehab Teaching and Research Unit, so of which I'm a very little part of. We are in an amazing postgrad rehabilitation teaching team, so that's my little marketing pitch. And we are very happy to host Professor Antonia Liguori from Teesside University in the UK. So Antonia is originally from Italy and moved to UK like 10 years ago.
10 years ago, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
And yes.
Still keeping my Italian accent.
Yes, yeah. And yeah, all about storytelling, community engagement, and participatory approaches is all her key themes of work.
And actually, as we were talking with our friends who just came, is also fighting inequality. So yeah, the main mission of my work is around that.
Perfect. And what's not in the bio is Antonia is an ardent horse rider, and she didn't play for Italy for volleyball, but she loves playing volleyball.
Yeah, I was a journalist, yeah, for volleyball. Yeah.
Oh, cool. And and she can make pizza from the scratch.
And pasta.
And pasta.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I think we'll let our Manohiri take over the stage, and we can keep the questions at the end for those of you online. And we have a dedicated Zoom coordinator looking after the Zoom whanau. So without further ado, I will let the stage to you, Antonia.
Thank you. Thank you. So first of all, just let me express my gratitude to HEM, the brilliant team around the research that HEM is conducting, which is the real motivator for me to be here. But then since I arrived, I found more and more motivations to be here. And one of the many is being with so many interesting people who are doing research that is so important. So I hope that whatever we are going to share and discuss is useful for me as well as for you. As Hem said, I've prepared, of course, some slides and a short presentation that I will try to keep shorter after I've been introduced to these colleagues here. So I hope we have more time to think about how to adapt this particular model I'm going to share with you today to the research you're currently doing. So let's keep this seminar as fluid as possible. But I'll give a short introduction, mainly to explain the roots. We were talking about the land, the importance of land, and the context in which we were born and we've been growing up is quite essential also for the way in which we do our job. And we shape, let's say, the mission around the work we do. So the plan, there is a plan, but it will be disrupted by its own nature. So the plan is to mainly focus on this participatory element within storytelling. That is the key component of my own research and practice, starting from an existing model that I'm going to introduce briefly, that is the story-centered digital storytelling model. And then I will just share a few examples of what I like to call creative disruptions, which are disruptions to the original model, mainly driven by this desire to make our qualitative research approach more accessible, engaging, and where possible, just and fair for the participants we work with. And actually, I would say we work for. While I'm going to go through some key experiences I had, I will talk about me, but everything I've been doing is not just me. It's mainly the team around me when I was back at Loughborough University and now at Teesside University, but mainly the local partners in any location I had the joy to work. And you will see I've been working from Latin America to India, East Africa, and I've got the joy now to be here with you all in this beautiful land. But mainly, the reason why I do research, as I was saying, is to try and see how we can start from a model and use that model through co-creation and collaboration in a way that is accessible, engaging, and effective. I think these are the key words of the kind of practices I'm going to share with you. But just to give you a bit of context, as we were saying, I was born in Italy, and I took a few pictures for you of the place where I don't live there because I live in the UK, but where my home and my family is. And this place is now called Latina. So the reason why I'm sharing this with you is to also justify academically my transition from history, which is my academic background. I did my PhD in history and computer science, and this practice called digital storytelling. That is the question people always ask me when we need to write a joint project together. They say, oh, what is your academic background? And then what kind of academic field should we consider for this research? So it's anything but history is deeply rooted in the way in which I then approach storytelling. So I had an interest and passion for understanding how people were responding to a very sad, bad time we had in Italy during the two wars. There was our dictatorship, right? So we had Mussolini as a dictator, and you imagine Italy is a very ancient country, but there are also new towns, and all these new towns were all built by Mussolini. And one of those is what we call now Latina, which originally was called Littoria. And this symbol here, so this is a sewage cover. So in the city, you can still walk and you can still find the original name, but everywhere else has been scrapped and deleted because, of course, we can't relate ourselves to fascism in any way. We don't want to, even if things are going quite not nicely at the moment. And this building you see, there is a building with an M shape, is a huge building, and Mussolini was so proud to fly over the city that he built and see his initial of his name on the land. So why I'm saying this? Because as I've been living in this place, I always felt disconnected, and I wanted to understand why people, the reasons why people were moving there, why they moved there, and how they were feeling about this transition from a past that was not glorious in terms of ideology, but was good for certain people for their own daily life, and how we could rebuild a new community despite these changes in the structure of buildings and, in the heritage, all the statues were demolished. So I was trying to learn from history, from the past, and recreate a community that was able to look forward and trying to find peace with the past that wasn't good for us, for the majority of us. But of course, there are contradictions. They changed the name of the city, but this is the name of the Central Park, and so it's dedicated to Mussolini's brother. So it's like this tension we always have in places where transitions happen, where, how those ideologies are often used and misused, and how we are sometimes not very truthful in the way in which we disconnect from a negative past. So all those problematic issues then brought me to this transition from history, social history, oral history, and then driven by this desire to have my own role within social justice and social activism, I then discovered this practice called digital storytelling. That is something I learned when I was still in Italy and we were setting up the first European network around digital storytelling, and was inspired by some key principles that I still apply in my research. As I said, in history, I try to discover those hidden narratives that very often are very deep and very often are very superficial. But those superficial and these deep narratives, they don't communicate with each other, so it's very difficult for people who are living in the middle to actually have the global, a wider understanding of those problems and how they are experienced in different times and places. And I like to call storytelling as to add this word participatory storytelling, and this is also my job title that I had to negotiate now that I moved to the new university, because I think that storytelling, as in the title of this presentation, is mainly about listening. So I believe in storytelling as an act of, as a mutual act of generosity, in which we spend time together to discover our own past. We share our memories to build something that is better for the future of everyone. And something that in research is very useful, and I will give you some examples, is to think about storytelling as a tool for us as academics to remember that we are human beings first, and therefore to try and dismantle those knowledge hierarchies that they are somehow implicit in the role we play in society, but very often they become explicit when we start running research projects, because our participants, co-researchers, co-producers of knowledge, they are very much aware of the privileges we have, of the role within our institutions, and those barriers are very often somehow limiting the success, the deep success, and the fact that participants could embrace and be really involved in the research process, feeling that authority at the same level as we believe we might have as academics as well. So I put here some visuals just to give you an idea of the variety of ways in which I've been applying storytelling, and then I will define what storytelling means for me, starting from the story center model. But mainly just to show you that it starts from oral history here on the bottom left that is quite, in my opinion, extractive. So when we interview people, we tend, and we had a conversation yesterday with Livia and Cheryl, your colleague as well, about this transition from interviewing to storytelling as a much more audience-oriented process. So when we interview in research, we tend to drive the conversation that is very much linked to the sort of brief we have in our mind that we need to achieve and respond to our research questions. When we transition into the storytelling environment, we need our participant to shift their attention to responding to our own interview questions and think about why and how the story they are sharing, whatever they are sharing, matters to other people. So it becomes like an important shift from looking at myself and feeling somehow investigated, interrogated, and quite passive, to myself now as a participant, as a storyteller, becoming an active knowledge producer, and therefore thinking about what I'm telling, for whom and why. And it's an important shift in collaboration within research. That, of course, has an impact on the way in which we conduct our storytelling activities. So as I said, I was fascinated by this original model called digital storytelling. And if you search on Google Story Center, Joe Lambert, you can read about the history of this global movement around digital storytelling. I hope we can share the slides. There is also a link to a video that we have no time. I prefer to save time to actually have conversations with you later. That is a brilliant introduction. It's around 7 minutes that Joe Lambert does about the history of the movement. And there is also the very first example in history of the first digital story. And it gives you an idea of why these people in California, they were working at Berkeley University. And there were media experts, artists. They were linked somehow, now that we have a Brazilian in the room, to the Theater of the Oppressed and Augusto Boa, and the work he was doing to use the arts to democratize the access and the production. At that moment was the access to knowledge. And the original model started with this mission to empower lay people, lay practitioners, and everyday people to use media to create short videos in which they could condense the essence of stories they wanted to share. This happened in the late 90s, but then over the years, they are still active and they are still globally recognized as the leaders in this field. They have developed a workshop model. So when you talk around the globe about digital storytelling and story center, you would expect people to recognize this workshop structure that I tried to summarize in this graphic as the core component of it. So they didn't develop this for research. They developed this for public engagement and, as I said, as a sort of form of activism and community cohesion. So to describe it briefly, how many of you are familiar with this model? Have you heard of it? One person heard of it? Yeah, so a few people. So if you were invited to the workshop by Joe Lambert or someone from his team or someone replicating this model, you would know that you would need a lot of time. So it's usually 3 to 5 days. During the pandemic, has been adapted because it moved online. So there is a new structure online over several weeks. But in general, what happens has got sort of rhythm around different activities. And we would start with an activity that we would call story circle. And the story circle is when we would invite participants to come together, generally small groups, I would say up to 10 for one facilitator, just to have enough time to have conversations. And in the story circle, participants who would have received a brief before coming so that they all know what kind of subject we are talking about with a few prompts and a few explanations of the process. They would come very often with an object or a photograph so that the story would start in this story circle as a flow of conversations where each individual would start sharing their own. For example, I could tell you the story behind this ring, which is an easier way in for people to frame their ideas around a narrative arc, a narrative form. So it's very often we would ask, please bring an object, please bring a picture, and behind that object, behind that picture, there is a story that only you can tell. So the work of storytelling and digital storytelling is about the uniqueness of each individual story and valuing that unique angle, unique perspective, and legitimating all those diverse, this diverse range of views, even if we are all talking about the same subject, the same topic. So story circle is the first step, and is when we start framing the idea around the story. It is a social process, and this is in the ethos of this practice. That is all about mutual learning, mutual support, collaboration, and interaction. So in the facilitation of the story circle, which is a key aspect of the process itself, we would allow time for everyone to provide feedback and ask questions, and so to support the storyteller to find the right focus for their story. And again, as I was saying, in this particular phase, listening is as important as telling, because the story that is shaped in a particular context, if we were doing a story circle, just the four of us now, would be different if tomorrow we were doing the story circle with them, because we are context-driven as human beings, and our stories can shift depending on who is in the room, how we feel in that particular moment, what happened last night, and if we are, anxious for something that is going to happen. So it's very important that we remind ourselves as researchers and facilitators that those stories are context-driven and driven by the people who are in that space. Then there is the second phase. That would be the script writing. So after the participants, they shared verbally their story, there would be a step for them to condense this 5-minute, 10-minute story they shared in a script of 200 words or 250 words. Why do we do 200 words or slightly longer? It's because then, for practical reasons, because the final output of the whole process is a video, we know that 200 words is around a 2-minute video. So that we know that there is also enough time for everyone to produce that video in the time allocated during the workshop. And also we know that non-professional video makers, if they make a 10 minutes video, no one is going to watch it. I mean, it's like to keep that also effective and rewarding for them. So we said story cycle step 1, script writing step 2, the third traditional conventional step would be voice recording. Which is, again, a very important step, because it's when the person who told the story, the person who wrote the story, is now reading that story. So it's going through these different languages and experimenting with the different shades of our way of expressing our feelings and sentiments to the different languages and interactions with people. Sometimes the recording happens on a one-to-one basis, so we would go in a separate space with a good microphone to capture and record the story that I would tell. I've been adapting these 2 steps and combining them, but I will tell you something later to make those more accessible, because writing is not always something that participants are keen to do, even if it's good for us as researchers to monitor the transition of the story through the different languages. And then after we've got this MP3, the audio file, it takes time to record. So when we organize workshops, we need to remember recording a 2-minute audio doesn't take 2 minutes. It can take 30 minutes, 40 minutes, because participants, they would try and try and try. And you would encourage them to try and try and try again, to sound natural. I very often reflect in this space with them about the importance of silence as well, and the importance of the pace of our voice. Reading probably is something we would do more quickly, but telling a story is different. So we need to work with participants in a way that retelling the story by reading from a script, it sounds still natural. And then we would move into the more technical part, that is an editing phase, video editing phase. So the participants, they brought with them a photo, an object, more than one photograph. They will learn how to edit this short film to combine their voice with some visuals. And we use very intuitive and easy video editing platform that very often they have a library of stock footage, stock images, sounds, music, if they want to use it. And then the most beautiful part, I have to say, of the whole process is the sharing at the end, when we all come together in a room like this and we play all those videos. Very often we invite external people, friends, family, to celebrate the immersion of those beautiful stories. And it's a very, sometimes emotional, it's a very rewarding experience for everyone. And for us as researchers, it's fantastic because it offers us additional opportunities to make even content analysis more participatory. So in one of the pictures I was showing up there at the beginning, talking about participatory storytelling, there was one in which we did participatory tagging, so that we were somehow coding, extracting themes from those stories while watching the stories together. And this was quite an interesting activity to do together, because we were reflecting on how we attribute different meanings to same words, or how we use different words to say the same thing. And back to my transition from history to storytelling, for me it wasn't traumatic at all, because in Italian it's the same word for history and story. So I never realized it until I moved to the UK, and then they asked. So as I said, this is in synthesis the original model that Story Center, Joe Lambert, his group developed in the late 90s, and it became quite popular in worldwide. It moved to the UK through a fantastic project called Capture Whales, and there was a broadcaster from the BBC, Daniel Meadows, who had been working with local communities, fishermen in particular, to collect the stories of those people and preserve those stories. But there is there is a but, there is a problem, again, in this kind of approach that the word collecting is somehow reflecting, because collecting is still an extractive approach, whereas I would strengthen the collaborative element, and we were talking about co-design earlier, so the fact that people, they are in charge. And I will share a few examples even about how even simply the 5 steps can become more collaborative if we enable participants themselves to co-facilitate those steps. And therefore, me as a facilitator, as an academic, as a researcher, I gradually step back, and the process itself is owned by the people who are there in the room. But before diving deeper in those tensions within this model and how to apply it and how it can serve interdisciplinary and participatory research, I want to share a couple of examples of digital stories so that you can see what is the end point of that traditional digital storytelling workshop. And these are 2 stories made by 2 of my students when I was at Loughborough. They were both data science students. And the brief we gave them was to actually use their own personal experiences to make data more accessible, memorable, and useful for each of us. So I'm going to play both of them, and then maybe we can stop for a little while and...
I'll just get rid of those messages first.
Yep. Oh, thank you. And the people online as well, if you can't hear, please let us know.
I like playing guitar. It feels good. It helps me cope with my mental health. It's not the only way I cope. I also speak with family and friends. And I also go out in nature. I live alone, so sometimes lots of thoughts overwhelm me, and I become depressed. I've learned to cope, though, by speaking up and seeking help. But it's not always been like this. When I was 14, I went to an all-boys high school in Kenya. I was bullied by older students, being woken up at 2 a.m., being beaten up. It was dark. My grades declined due to lack of sleep, and there was always this constant fear that I would fail at the end of it all. I got depressed. I wanted to transfer, but my dad didn't let me. He said it was a good school and other things. I almost lost all hope, till my sisters convinced my dad to let me transfer. They opened his eyes and I finally got transferred. I became better after that. I won this battle with help, and the question remains, what about others like me with the same culture-induced stigma that prevents speaking out? Just because you're a man doesn't mean you have to be tough. We're all human. We need to speak up, to be heard, so that we get the help we deserve, the help we need.
And I'm sharing the second one, and then we can have a little chat about both of them.
School teaches us that we can do anything if we try. Well, I wanted to be an athlete, an Olympic athlete, and so I tried at that. I trained hard. and after a few years I started winning medals, representing my club, school, county, region. I medalled at national events. I was still hungry to improve and training harder than ever. At 17, I made the top 5 athletes under the age of 20 for my event in the UK and was being considered for European level competition. I was happy. And then I got injured. Stress fractures in my spine left me with chronic back pain, which was getting worse and worse. So I had to stop. I had to quit. I found it difficult to transition to a life outside of sport. I'd lost my sense of identity. I felt lost, empty, passionless. I felt like I'd wasted my big chance. I felt like a failure. Fast forward to now. I found a new passion. I go to music events, concerts and festivals and see artists perform amazing music. They inspire me to write my own music, like the music you're listening to right now. I think school got it backwards. It's not you can do anything if you try. It's you can try and do anything. Because I now believe that effort is success. And I'm happier now than I've ever been.
Any reaction from you? And maybe we can go around with the microphone for a second, so we have a little break, and then I'll talk. So I'll stop talking for a while. What do you think? Did it make you think, react emotionally? And
I was really impressed by how professional they look. When you were describing that process, I thought you'd come up with something more amateurish, should I say? But those two were amazing. It's like, were they the best of the bunch?
They were very good, very good students. We spent 5 days together to go through the process as an intense block. So I like to teach this module as a block taught module in a week and just spend 5 full days with them. So, but of course they enjoyed the technical aspect. Some of the images that were from the library I was describing from the WeVideo software, so they could take those, and these are the ones who look even more professional, I would say. But yeah.
Were they both in the same workshop, those two?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they were both in the same workshop. But it's very important that our participants, they don't feel that the most polished stories are the most effective stories. And I think in practice, the first story, which I love, is very simple to make because he did everything with his mobile phone. He was just filming himself. And then he got a couple of images from his school back in Kenya, and then he used only stock footage and images. So I don't think he spent a huge amount of time for editing that. And it's something that anyone can do, anyone can make if supported. But yeah, any other thoughts? I heard some of you smiling at certain, so what I really like of both is also the way in which they've been using text on screen. So the work we do in workshops is also to reflect on the potential of these short films, that is not just combining a couple of images with the voice, but there is much more. There can be silence, or even the second story he used as a soundtrack and music he composed, and he said, like this music you're hearing right now. So it's also creating this connection with the audience in a way that is more dynamic. So yes, and the first one was very clever in making us smile, even if it was talking about a very tough moment of his life, tough subject. So it's also using irony and the different ways of coping with what we need to share in such a natural way. And we could feel whatever they were feeling in the different parts of the story. The other thing we reflect on when we work with this in the workshops is thinking about the waves of the emotions in a story. So it's not just the narrative arc, they have a very strong, you can see there is a strong narrative in both, where there is a change that happens that is quite at the peak of the narrative. But they are also very good in, I think probably the first one even more, in exploring the waves of emotions, even in the pace of the voice. So that was very slow when he was remembering something very tough. And something I really like is when he said, and my dad was saying this and more, and then he couldn't express verbally what his dad said, but he wrote it on the screen, which is something very important of digital storytelling as a way of making even untold, unspoken, and unspokeable situations emerge. Because even when we feel that we can't use words to describe it, we can write and show when it's too painful to even rethink about it. So I thought that was very effective, and yeah. Great.
Just sharing a little bit about Zoom. So we had a comment from Denise saying that the videos were very moving and powerful in such a short space of time, using this combination of visuals and words and sound. And Lynette also had a question about who is the intended audience of those videos.
So each of them had to identify an intended audience, and this is very important. I was saying earlier the difference between an interview. So the audience, even in an interview, is quite a close environment, because when we interview someone, we are the audience. So somehow there is a sort of, it's more difficult to make those conversations open and wider. Whereas in a digital storytelling workshop, we would spend some time in identifying the primary audience. Of course, those stories that go everywhere. Now you're watching, you are the audience, right? But probably they didn't know you would have been watching their stories. So each of them had selected a particular audience. And it's very funny because sometimes people, they work with an audience in mind that, for example, I think the first one was for other people in similar situations to speak up. Other men who were struggling and they were not able to share what they were feeling. I was asking, would you share this story with your dad? And he said, no. So it's like, it's making people aware about the multiplicity of audiences that such stories could have. And therefore, because the audience can shift the way in which we talk about things. So if we were asking the first student, oh, this is a story for your dad, the same facts, they would have been framed and shaped in a completely different way. So it would have told something completely different. So that's a very important aspect. So something to reiterate, which is quite important of this practice, is the fact that digital storytelling and storytelling must, it's the only thing that must be a slow process. So as academics, we are very much driven by, getting the response we need, getting the data. But to make things emerge, it takes time. So I was chatting in Auckland with your colleagues about the slow food movement in Italy that and I think of storytelling as a slow learning movement, because it's about learning about ourselves, it's about learning from other people, it's about making people learn about myself. So it's a sort of collaborative space for everyone to learn, but in a very slow and enjoyable way that somehow revitalize all our senses. So it's not just interdisciplinary, it's a multi-sensorial experience where we actually rethink about sound and, touching things, objects, and how we feel to reconnect ourselves with our very deep way of interpreting and learning, how kids learn. I mean, kids, they learn by touching and, and then we articulate with the language and we express in a different way.
I'm not sure how that began, like what were you recruiting for, men's mental health, or like what was the... So
they were a group of students and I gave them 3 big challenges, and the 4th was a free theme they wanted to explore. And the majority of them, we were just after the pandemic, the majority of them, they just went for mental health. There was one was around mental health, one was around education, and one was around climate change and environmental issues. So they were sent, when we do these workshops, we have a sort of template with a short description of what the digital story is, and then I would say 4 or 5 questions to help participants think about the particular theme they want to reflect on. And those questions we would put in this type of template. They would not be yes or no answer, questions that you can't ask a person and they would respond with yes or no, but these are questions in which they would rethink about a particular moment or something that happened in their life or a particular person that inspired them. So the entry point for a story, they can be multiple because we all think in different ways. I remember the first time I did my workshop with Joe Lambert, and I was in Malta. It was a very difficult time for me because I had to decide if to go to Naples, my hometown, to my grandmother's funeral, or to go to this training in Malta. And then I've been thinking, and then I said, I'll go to the training, because with the training, I think I can be more useful to more people afterwards. My grandmother, I'll be connected with her for the rest of my life. It's like, and then for me, that workshop was so meaningful. And the first question, and because I was in that sort of mindset, when Joe Lambert was prompting us, I still remember, I just focused on one question that was about sound, and was about what is the first sound that you remember from your childhood. And because I was in that moment of, reconnecting with my family and being unable to travel there and, all these kind of things, then sound was the dominant sense in because I could hear voices, you know what I mean? It's like the way in which we connect and we find our own entry point to a story is very different depending on our, the context in which we are and the way in which we feel in that particular moment. So the questions I was listing in the template, for example, I would list in the template would also touch on different type of senses. So it's like, why I like this ring is because it's glass, and glass is very fragile, and it reminds me of the person who gave me this ring, who is very fragile. It's like the brain, when it's triggered and prompted to navigate freely, is just fantastic, and things, they emerge in such a unique and beautiful way that an interview would not achieve in the same way. And I was a journalist, so I've been interviewing people all the time, and as a researcher as well. But in a storytelling setting, in a storytelling process, we are all much more oriented to dive deeper and to make emerge what is unexpected. Whereas in an interview, very often we respond to questions to somehow respond to the expectations of the interviewer. So it's more top-down and driven by a particular, let's say, mission. But back to digital storytelling as a model in research, of course, I support all my colleagues and practitioners globally who are applying it, but in research it's not always feasible. We very rarely, we have the privilege to spend 5 full days with our co-researchers and participants. People are busy, they have busy lives. So my main interest is in how to make this beautiful process accessible for everyone, respecting the ethos and the principles that motivated this community to make this model emerge. We were talking this morning, I think, with Peter earlier about impact and the importance of impact in research, especially in the UK. There is a strong push towards social impact. But of course, in my own way of believing on this model and this approach as something for people to get positive impact, I think that's the driver in the way in which we need to redesign the, let's say, the conventional 5-step process. And another big issue of applying this model in research is the sustainability. So Olivia, you were saying that living some projects in your previous experience has been a sort of grieving, you know, when we leave our participants at the end of a process, it can be painful because we know that funding are expiring and nothing else is happening after that. So how do we cope with that? How do we make our research carry on in a community? And I think that this process, if we enable the people in the community to run themselves the workshops, then there is a higher chance for those communities to keep trying and keep making those stories reconnect and be more impactful for their own community as well. So what I tend to do when now I apply for funding for research is not just for me to go and run workshops, but it's to spend time with people locally and train them and design a process that is locally and culturally appropriate. Because there are existing practices, as I'm learning here, for example, back in my country or in other countries. I've been working in Colombia, for example, where there is something very similar to MRI that they call Maloca. So there are places, context, local practices that can be brought into the model and then reach the model and make the model feasible and sustainable for the communities. But again, the key principle, I will never, so we can cut off of the 5 steps, we can cut 3 steps, but we need to keep some principles. And the most important one is to actually balance very well the digital component you've been experiencing by watching those stories with the human aspect, the human touch of the facilitation process, which is what will last forever in people's memories. And what will last forever in ourselves as well, and will make us better researchers and better human beings. And something that is key is actually learning to become more and more active listeners and making sure that we allow our participants to have that role of active listeners, even if they don't feel they are ready to share their story. So I very often have been sitting in story circles where people were overwhelmed by the idea of sharing their story because they never felt that their story was heard. And so having 6, 7, 8 people just looking at you, waiting for you to frame that story was for some people quite stressful. But they then moved into the next steps and had the chance to explore their narrative in smaller groups or in pairs. In additional activities I created for that particular group, and then I'm using more and more often. And one of these is collaborative storyboarding that I very often use, especially in international groups. So as I speak a second language myself as well, I know that if I were telling my own story in my own first language, I would be able to explore even deeper the different nuances and different shades of feelings because I have a better, I know more words and I can express myself in a more diverse way. So we use collaborative storyboarding very often as an exercise in pairs to support the active listening loop. And so, for example, I would be the storyteller and you would be the story listener. and you would use a storyboarding template to capture my story. And by doing that, you would ask me questions to help me identify my primary audience, to help me identify the key message, to help me have those waves of emotions, understand the change moment, the topical moment in my narrative arc. So in this collaborative, intimate exercise, and then we would swap, we would do the same, yeah, so that I would experience on both sides the listening and the telling. And then we would go back to the bigger group, and I would present your story, and you would present my story. And this is quite powerful. In research, it's very useful, but it's very powerful because we think about interpretation and how something we deliver can be received in a completely different way, and how storytelling, story listening can help us find a common ground in between, where what I say is actually what you understand in exactly the same way, which is very interesting from a language perspective. But in research, again, and I was talking with you about observation. When we run digital storytelling workshops for research, I would strongly recommend to have a colleague who would be there as observer, so that we could somehow analyze not just the transition from, and of course everything would be recorded, not just the transition from how I tell my story, how I write my story, how I craft my story, but also how I interact while let's say this selection process of condensing a story in a 2-minute film is somehow driven by social interactions. So, and it's very powerful to have someone with experience in observation and observing in research to capture all those different, and also looking after the well-being of the people, making sure that we have measures in place to adjust the process and not being, obliged to respond to our plan. What we planned can be always adjusted depending on the responses from the people in the room. And of course, well-being is something to keep in mind, because this is a process that can be painful as well as joyful. But sometimes painful processes are very positive at the end. So something as I said, a great motivator of my research is to think about how we can support communities in coming together and working together for a better future, even when those voices sometimes they're not saying the same things, or even better. So I mean, my culture in Italy, we are very used to have arguments. So arguments are a positive moment of connecting people and actually sharing opposing views, knowing that we are in a safe space in which we can share those opposing views. But very often communities in which have been working they can't. They know that they can't even share their view. So very often I like to work on community storytelling, not just individual storytelling. For example, in the project on gender-based violence, we've been trying to craft stories that were not exposing the individuals, but were responding to somehow interpreting those stories and making those stories accessible with a projection into the future as well. Because very often we think of storytelling, and maybe because I come from history, but we think of stories as something that happened in the past. But I'm really appreciating even more now the way in which we can use storytelling to think about the future and project ourselves into a space that is the space where the community can thrive as well. And I've been doing this work in particular around climate change, where we were trying to, and this is a project we did in Kenya with those women that were all community leaders. And this was a very contested topic. So all these women, they were all working in a dumping site nearby, which was very dangerous for their health. There were all the smokes. And this was a great learning opportunity for me, because I had to shift the 5-step process quite quickly on the ground, because they told me that, for example, we had no electricity, so we couldn't make the stories. So we then redesigned the process in a way that the event would be a performance, a performative storytelling event. And for example, before the story circle, they didn't want to follow my brief, which was good, but they said, we need to go and take the pictures in a place. So the project was about environmental issues. And they said, no, we're not bringing anything, we bring you in a place. So we went on the top of this dumping site, which was closed and was also illegal to be there. And they want us to take pictures, because many of those women, they go there to work and collect plastic bags, realizing or not realizing the danger for their, especially for their breathing and their health. And so what happened, we discovered that within this group of 10 women, the younger women, they were completely against the fact that their mother would go and work there, not just for their mental health, their breathing health, but also for the fact that, you know, it wasn't safe for them to go there. And very often they were not coming back home as they were hoping to. So we changed the process, and we thought to think about conflicting views and using stories to represent those conflicting views, because even if we disagree, but I'm able to empathize with your daily life, with your daily experience, and why you do that, I probably get a better understanding of why you are in favor or not of something I would disagree with. So it's like using storytelling as a bridge, even when disagreement happens, because those emotions that we can recognize in other people's stories can anyway create a supportive network, even if there is no agreement on the particular subject and topic we are addressing. And this is something I did recently with a group of younger researchers. This is a paper we wanted to think about, that is for the future of storytelling, what the younger, because for us, I mean, people of my age, digital is something that came to my life later, so I wasn't born with anything digital. But for the younger generation, if you ask a younger person now, do you know digital storytelling? They would say, yes, I've got TikTok or whatever. But actually, it's hard to make them think about the potential of this tool, because their media literacy is driven by the use of social media. So we've been reflecting with younger generations of researchers on how to expand the model of digital storytelling through different techniques, and they were expert in illustration, animation, and education. But what was the core component of the conversations we had was about challenging our own way of thinking and our own disciplinary backgrounds to respond to the, you know, to respond and actually replicate the ethos and of this practice, to amplify the key principle of this practice. I just put here an illustration of a process we did in preparation of a workshop, like the workshop we will be doing with Hem and your team. So in this case, our co-design process was captured in an illustration, and then this illustration was given to the community as a way of supporting them in recreating other similar workshops. So was sort of thinking about the different phases of a workshop in a visual way to then prompt a further conversation, discussion on ways in which we could adapt the 5 steps model to a real locally driven process. But that was just a picture I liked and I wanted to share with you. I will probably end here because we are 1 o'clock. These were more examples I wanted to share, but we can have a conversation now if you have time. And these were just other opportunities to support participants become facilitators. But I think, have you got anything you want to discuss in particular?
Antonia, we have some questions from
Yes.
Zoom. So the first one came after you showed the 2 videos made by your students, but I think it applies to everyone that enrolls in the storytelling process. What was the impact of this process for the storytellers?
Yeah, it is always quite unpredictable and is always very concrete, so we can monitor it. It's very, very often people in the group, they feel connected with each other in a very deep way. So once the workshop ended, those people, they became friends and they kept meeting and they kept having conversations. And so there was a positive impact at community level that those people were not connected before. And this always happens whenever we go, or even if they were connected before, they would say, oh, I never thought that you did that, or I never thought you were experiencing that. So it's, in terms of impact, it enables deeper conversations to happen afterwards. So it's a long-lasting impact. And it's, for the younger generations, is also quite rewarding because they learn new skills on something they like to use, that is creating new media. For the older generations, is more, and this opportunity to feel that whatever we share is valued by other people and is kept by the community, somehow celebrated and kept, so that the people in the workshop, they become the custodians of something that risks to be lost. So, yeah, I'm now working on a large initiative in England called The Making of Black Britain, and we are creating a large archive of digital stories to celebrate the life of those people who came from Africa and the Caribbean community before it's too late, before people that really lose the opportunity, they miss the opportunity to celebrate those lives, and they give for granted that, you know, we are all part of the same land. So yes, it's impactful and joyful.
Thank you. I've got a question about how do you use the stories to then extract themes for research? You've talked lots about participants and their experiences, but what about from researchers' points of view? Research
experience. So of course we need to analyze data. So when we use, I would analyze both the process and the outputs. So what I would do, I would collect all the scripts, I would record the story cycle, and of course then, because they work on a software that is cloud-based and they have control on that software, I can see also the different edits, and I can support them while they're editing as well. So I would analyze what they said, how they've been moving from a long story to a short story, what type of, the decision-making process behind those choices, and the different choices they made, for example, with the text on screen. Or if they are working on a storyboard to plan their video, I would keep the storyboard and see all their notes on the storyboard. Very often I produce storyboards in templates with some prompts for them to follow, and some of them are more technical, some of them are more linked to the narrative arc, some of them are more linked to the emotions they want to prompt, and at what point those emotions in the narrative they come. And as I said, I would have an observer in the room taking observation notes, depending on the type of subject. The important thing to remember is also that in research, we analyze the collection of stories as well. So it's not just each individual workshop, but if we are running more than one workshop, I've been recently using, we've been developing some plugins for WordPress websites that they are for thematic analysis of the stories transcripts. And they would allow also participatory tagging from web users to refine, as I was saying, the thesaurus or the glossary of the different themes. So yes.
Sorry, so many questions here. Has it been done, or what are your thoughts on doing this via Zoom? And also, could you do it, take a much longer process, like 6 months, and maybe meet on Zoom like once a month and do segments slowly like that? Just thinking of a way to do it more practically than a week of everyone getting together.
Yeah, we've been doing it over online, of course, during the pandemic, and then we became more literate around Zoom and Teams. It's actually very positive in a way. I had very positive feedback from participants because they can join from anywhere. I even had feedback from a young guy from Washington, D.C. who said he felt safer in the story circle online because they could switch their camera off, or they could switch the microphone off if they felt emotional. So, which is not easy for the facilitator because then you don't know what's happening, but for participants can be good. So I did it over a number of weeks, and this is also positive because, as you saw in the process, there are certain activities that are meant to be done socially, but certain other activities that we can do in our own spare time, like video editing or recording. I would give more, for example, I would spend time, if we were meeting like for an hour or two on Zoom the week one for the story circle, and then they would have time to actually think about the script. And then when we come back together, they would have already the script ready. And so we would come together just to provide feedback and help each other, and probably practicing in reading it. And then the audio recording can be done. The best space for me for audio recording is the car, because it's quite good in terms of sound. There is no echo. Or if you live, or opening your wardrobe and with your head in the wardrobe, because it's a nice sound as well. And then I would provide a video editing tutorial, and then they would spend their own time as long as they want to refine their story. We meet again to watch the draft of the story, they refine it, and then we meet for the screening. So yes, it can be done, and it's very practical and useful. But of course, there might be the access to digital technology can be a barrier for some, so we need to provide that for everyone. The software I use that's cloud-based and is called WeVideo is also on mobile apps, and there is a free version, so it can be easy for some people to work on their phones. There was a question here.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to know what happens to the videos after the end of the workshops.
Yeah, we had a very long conversation yesterday with our researchers here. This must be agreed with the participants. So in the briefing session, before the story circle, there would be a briefing in which you would go through all your consent forms and everything. And it must be agreed with them if they want those videos to be online, in a project website, on YouTube or not, if they want those videos to be used in events like this, or if they want to keep those just for the people in the workshop and the screening, or if they just want to keep them for themselves. So I did a project with a colleague and was about grief, and some of the participants that were not ready to share the videos at the end of the process. But that was a beautiful project, because then we worked with a colleague who is an expert in making jewelry. So, and we bought the smallest of the screens you could imagine. And then people were making their ring or their, I don't know the name in English, but anything they could wear, like a piece of jewelry. And their story would be in this tiny screen embedded into the object. So they could wear it, even if they were not able to share the story, they could wear it. And when they were ready, this tiny screen in the ring or wherever they wanted to create this object, anything they wanted to create, had a little USB port, so we could share it when they were ready. So it was a little pilot. Yeah, it's a little pilot idea, but fantastic. Yeah, very powerful.
Antonia, we also had a a question here about how the stories are archived and accessed. So I think this one answers.
Yeah, the archive aspect of it. We had a conversation with another colleague, Tess, in Auckland, and we were talking about, for example, for the making of Black Britain, for the value of those stories we are creating now, we made an agreement with the British Library, for example. So when we recognize that certain stories, they should be there forever, because we know that the life of a project is quite short. And even if we have funding to buy a project website, then probably the funding would cover 5 years for a project website, and then it will collapse. So then what happens next? So there are certain projects in which we are pushing to, not pushing, I mean in a gentle way, but we are trying to have agreements in place with institutions that could preserve those stories, let's say, forever. And it's also a little battle, because then, for example, an institution like the British Library, they would have an oral history archive. So for them would be an easy yes to say, yes, that's your oral histories will come here. But then digital stories, they are new objects from an archivistic perspective. From an archivist perspective, so we had to convince them that digital stories were important, and what type of metadata to include in a digital story, which is a video. So the standard metadata for a video would be good for a digital story. But I've been doing some work with the Smithsonian Institution, and they have a fantastic platform called Smithsonian Learning Lab, where users can upload their material as well. And some of our projects are there for the use of other educators and other people globally.
I have more questions here. Yeah? Anyone has a question here?
I'm mindful of the time.
I'm happy to stay here for any...
we might close, Antonia, and then,
yes.
Thank you so much, Antonia. We can listen to your story of doing stories, collecting stories forever. But we thoroughly enjoyed your koriro. And Antonia will be here in Poniki for another 10 days. So if you want to get in touch to have a hui with her, we can make a time. And tēnā koutou kato. Thank you very much for coming. And I'm also hungry and want to talk more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.